April 18, 1943. Dawn creeps over a misty runway at Barksdale Field as a nervous aircrew climbs into a machine the Germans laugh about. A squat, muscular bomber with wings too small and engines too powerful. The Martin B-26 Marauder. A plane German pilots dismiss as the flying piano, claiming it flies straight, stiff, and doomed. American ground crews don't smile. They've seen this aircraft buck hard on takeoff and punish anyone who mishandles it. Yet orders are orders, and today's raid will decide whether the Marauder is a failure or a misunderstood weapon. Engines growl like chained animals fighting steel. The runway trembles. And as the aircraft begins its roaring sprint, one question hangs in the cold Louisiana air. Will this bomber silence its doubters, or prove the Germans right? The roar of the Marauder's engines had not yet echoed across Europe, but its reputation already had. Stories spread through briefing rooms from Florida to North Africa. Stories of pilots fighting a machine that demanded perfection in a sky that rarely offered mercy. The B-26 flew fast, almost unnaturally fast for a medium bomber of its size. Its narrow wings gripped the air with the stubbornness of a blade, leaving no room for sloppy hands or slow reflexes. To veterans, it was a challenge. To rookies, it was a threat. And to German pilots who intercepted American radio chatter, it was an easy joke. They called it the flying piano, insisting it flew stiff like a wooden board and dropped out of the sky like a stone once damaged. They mocked its short wings, its high landing speeds, and the accidents that made newspapers back home. But the mockery masked fear they no longer admitted openly. Because anything America built in numbers was worth watching. And anything America refused to cancel was worth worrying about. The story of the Marauder began long before its engines first barked to life. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps needed a fast medium bomber for a world that was changing faster than old doctrines could keep up with. Europe was burning. Armor was sweeping across borders. Air superiority was rewriting the rules of ground warfare. The Air Corps wanted speed, range, and a hard punch. They wanted something that could outrun enemy fighters and hit targets too far for the slower B-18s to reach. So Glenn L. Martin's company delivered the B-26, an airplane built not lightly, but aggressively, like it had been carved for war before war even arrived. The first crews who trained on the Marauder in 1941 met a machine that didn't hold back. Its engines demanded respect. Its wings punished hesitation. Its controls were firm, almost rigid, yet sharp enough to catch a pilot off guard. Training accidents multiplied, and newspapers began whispering doubts about the new bomber. Reporters called it dangerous. Politicians called it flawed. Families of pilots called it cursed. And across the Atlantic, German intelligence listened. They took every American criticism and turned it into a punchline. To them, the B-26 was an overbuilt failure. A heavy piano with wings too small to matter. A bomber that would never survive real combat. But the truth was more complicated. The Marauder wasn't dangerous because it was weak. It was dangerous because it was advanced. It flew at speeds that demanded a fighter pilot's instincts from bomber crews who weren't trained for such aggression. It needed finesse, not fear. Precision, not panic. And for the pilots who mastered it, the aircraft transformed from a challenge into a weapon unlike anything the Germans expected. By late 1942, the U.S. Army wasn't ready to give up on the Marauder. Every loss was studied. Every mishap dissected. Engineers lengthened wings on later models, strengthened systems, and improved training. Pilots started learning on dual control trainers rather than climbing straight into combat models. Veteran instructors drilled new crews with an intensity that bordered on merciless. Slow hands were corrected. Nervous habits were broken. By the time a crew was cleared for combat, they no longer feared the Marauder. They respected it. Europe, however, wasn't waiting for any aircraft to mature. The RAF was fighting for survival. Convoys were burning in the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies over France with confident swagger. And the Americans were preparing to enter a theater where every mistake meant a crew that never returned. Into this firestorm, the B-26 would arrive. Not as a polished legend. Not as a favorite. But as an aircraft with something to prove. German pilots watched the early arrivals and shrugged. They believed the Marauder's flaws would finish the job for them. A few bursts of cannon fire, a well-timed pass, and the stiff-winged bomber would spiral downward like a broken piano dropped from a balcony. They underestimated the one thing the plane had more than any statistic showed: speed. And not just speed on paper. Speed in the moments that mattered. Speed that turned interception angles into miscalculations. Speed that forced German aces to attack with precision they rarely needed against slower Allied bombers. Back in American bases, rumors swirled from crew to crew. Some swore the plane was cursed. Others insisted it was the best bomber in the world once you learned its rhythm. But everyone agreed on one thing. The Marauder didn't tolerate fear. If you hesitated, it punished you. If you mastered it, it rewarded you. And this balance of danger and promise created a machine that divided opinions but united crews who survived it. By early 1943, the stage was set. America was sending its bomber groups into Europe with a mix of hope, training, and unanswered questions. German fighters were eager to meet these new machines. Commanders believed the Marauder would be easy prey. American crews believed the opposite. The truth waited in the skies over the English Channel, in a world where arrogance could kill and innovation could save. And above all, one unspoken question followed every takeoff. Would the flying piano play its own funeral march, or something the Germans never saw coming? The first Marauder cruise to cross the Atlantic carried a strange mix of confidence and tension. Their aircraft felt powerful, almost impatient, as if it wanted the war to begin before they even reached England. Inside the cockpit, gauges vibrated with a constant hum that never let a pilot forget the force beneath his hands. The control yoke felt heavier than most expected, but once trimmed properly, the aircraft settled into a smooth, predatory glide. It was a strange duality. A machine that punished inexperience yet rewarded precision with unmatched performance. And everyone aboard knew they were flying something the Germans mocked without ever truly understanding. On the ground in England, the reception was cautious. British crews eyed the B-26 with raised eyebrows. They measured everything by hard experience. They still remembered early American aircraft that had arrived with enthusiasm but struggled under real combat conditions. The Marauder looked different. Faster. Tighter. A bomber that resembled a fighter stretched into something larger, with engines that snarled like they belonged on a racing machine. RAF officers watched its early training flights with skepticism, noting every wobble on approach and every pilot who pulled too tightly on the controls. But something quietly impressed them. When the B-26 lifted its nose and roared into the sky, it climbed with the stubborn confidence of a machine built to outrun danger rather than absorb it. The first combat briefing arrived sooner than most crews expected. A low-level strike on key rail yards in occupied France. The target sat behind layers of German defenses, radar sites, patrol fighters, and flak guns known for ripping bombers apart. As crews gathered in the dimly lit room, smoke drifting above their heads, the commanding officer pointed to the route across the channel. The enemy would hear them coming. The enemy would be waiting. But the Marauder, he reminded them, was built for this. Fast in. Fast out. Hit hard. Leave no time for interception. Pilots exchanged long glances. Some tightened their gloves. Some stared at the maps without blinking. Every man in that room knew what the Germans thought of their bomber. Every man also knew that mockery didn't kill you, underestimation did. If the Luftwaffe didn't take the B-26 seriously, this might be the moment the joke turned on them. Takeoff that morning became its own test. The Marauder's engines bellowed under full power, pushing the heavy bomber down the airfield with a force that pressed bodies deep into their seats. For new pilots, this moment was everything. Rotate too early, and the plane stalled. Rotate too late, and the runway disappeared. But the crews had drilled for weeks, landing and taking off until the motions etched into muscle memory. Wheels lifted at the perfect second, wings bit into cold English air, and the bomber climbed briskly toward formation altitude. High above the channel, the formation tightened. The coast of France appeared as a gray line on the horizon. Nervous breaths filled intercoms. Each man scanned the sky for the first hint of German fighters. The Luftwaffe rarely ignored bombers this close to their territory. Yet for long minutes, the skies remained eerily quiet. Flak found them first. Black blossoms erupted in front of the formation, punching the air with violent bursts. Metal fragments rattled against the Marauder's armored belly. The pilots held steady, adjusting altitude in small, precise movements to avoid predictable patterns. The bomber's speed became obvious now. It sliced through the flak zone faster than German gunners were used to. Their usual timing felt off. Shells burst behind the formation instead of inside it. The first German fighters arrived moments later, sleek Bf-109s and rugged Fw-190s diving from altitude. Their pilots radioed excitedly about the flying piano formation below them. They expected easy kills. They expected slow turns and frightened gunners. They expected an aircraft that crumpled under pressure. They were wrong. The lead 109 tore downward in a classic stern attack, but the Marauder's tail guns barked instantly, spraying a tight arc of fire that forced the fighter to pull up early. The German pilot cursed into his mask. He hadn't expected that. The bomber wasn't just fast, it reacted fast. A 190 swept in from the side, aiming for the wing root of the leftmost Marauder. But the American pilot nudged his aircraft slightly faster, spoiling the German's firing angle and forcing him to slip wide. It was a small movement, a subtle correction, but it revealed everything. The B-26 wasn't trapped by its speed. It used its speed. Another fighter dove behind the formation, expecting to slide into a blind zone. Instead he met a curtain of .50 caliber fire from overlapping arcs. The B-26 carried fewer guns than a B-17, but they were placed with ruthless efficiency: nose, tail, waist, and a high dorsal turret that tracked like a hawk. The fighter peeled away trailing smoke, suddenly aware that these bombers did not behave like lumbering targets. Down below, the French countryside flashed by in streaks of green and brown. The Marauders dropped to treetop height, buzzing church steeples and farm roofs with terrifying speed. German fighters hesitated to follow. Low-level combat demanded nerve, and one mistake at this altitude meant a fiery crash. The 109s hung higher, waiting for the bombers to climb again. But the Marauders never gave them that chance. The target appeared ahead, a rail yard crowded with locomotives, fuel cars, and artillery shipments moving toward the eastern front. Flak guns fired wildly from sandbagged positions. The Marauders split slightly, each pilot eyes locked on the bombing run. Their speed made the approach difficult. There was no time to correct a mistake. Either you lined up perfectly, or you missed entirely. Bomb bay doors opened. The wind howled through the fuselage. Bombardiers released on the leader's mark, sending a chain of explosions racing across the yard. Fuel cars erupted in towers of flame. Locomotives flipped like toys. A wave of heat washed over the formation as they pulled away. Now the Germans reacted with desperation. More fighters arrived. Flak intensified. But the Marauders accelerated into their escape run with a ferocity that left their attackers scrambling. German pilots cursed in disbelief as the bombers pulled away faster than expected. They thought they were chasing a piano. They were chasing a saw blade. One German pilot pushed his 109 to catch up, engine whining near redline. He inched closer, ready to fire, until the Marauder abruptly surged ahead, engines roaring at full military power. The bomber left the fighter behind as if it had hit an invisible wall. The German slammed his fist against the canopy. This was no stiff, clumsy machine. This was speed weaponized. By the time the Marauders reached the channel again, their remote gunners had counted multiple confirmed hits. Not a single bomber had gone down. Not a single crew had failed to return. Ground crews watched in awe as the formation approached the runway, sunlight glinting off the battered fuselages. Pilots stepped out pale, exhausted, hearts still racing from the low-level escape. But they were alive. And the Germans were no longer laughing. Word spread quickly across bases. The flying piano had survived its first dance under fire. And not just survived. It had outflown, outpaced, and outmaneuvered everything thrown at it. But the Marauders' true test had not yet come. Germany had seen a glimpse of what it could do. They would answer with something far more brutal. And the B-26 would have to prove itself again. This time with the war's deadliest stakes in play. For a brief moment, the Marauder enjoyed a reputation it had never tasted before. Crews respected it. Commanders trusted it. And the Luftwaffe, though bruised, still refused to admit what they had seen in the skies over France. They called the failed interception an accident. Bad timing. Poor coordination. Anything except the truth. But Germany was about to learn the reality of the B-26 in a place where excuses could not survive. A place where small mistakes became mass graves. A place where even legends broke under pressure. That place was the coast of the Netherlands. The mission that changed everything began on a cold morning in May 1943. Fog clung to the runways at Borum and Earl's Cone, turning the airfields into islands of shadow and steel. The 322nd Bomb Group gathered quietly around maps lit by dim lamps. Officers traced yesterday's losses in red. Convoys hit. Bridges destroyed. Rail yards shattered. But the Germans were adapting. They shifted fighter patrols, moved flak batteries, and built new ambush zones in places the Marauder had not yet flown. Today's target was a complex maze of fuel depots and storage tanks near IJmuiden, one of the most heavily defended coastal cities in occupied Europe. German gunners there didn't just expect bombers. They trained for them. They built overlapping fire zones designed to tear apart anything slower than a diving fighter. And the B-26 was fast, but not invincible. Pilots listened to the briefing in tense silence. They had flown the Marauder long enough to trust its strengths. They also knew its weaknesses. The plane could not soak up damage like a B-17. It could not limp home with half a wing missing. If the B-26 lost too much speed, it died. The briefing ended with a warning no one missed. The Luftwaffe knew they were coming. Radio intercepts had picked up fragments of chatter. German pilots were preparing an ambush. Not with isolated fighters. Not with scattered patrols. With entire squadrons. But the mission couldn't be scrubbed. The fuel depots supplied U-boats stalking the Atlantic. Every tanker destroyed meant convoys saved. This was bigger than one squadron. Bigger than one bomber type. Bigger even than the crews sitting silently in the briefing room. This was a turning point in the air war. Crews walked to their aircraft with a weight that didn't slow their steps but sharpened them. Gunners tapped their barrels, whispering private promises to fate. Bombardiers touched the cold metal of the bomb racks with ritualistic focus. And pilots, always last to show fear, ran fingers across the yokes and throttles as if greeting an old friend who might not survive the day. Takeoff felt heavier. Wheels left the runway in slow, disciplined arcs. Engines strained against the cool morning air. Formations tightened earlier than usual, each crew sensing that this mission carried a different kind of tension. Crossing the channel had become routine. Today, it felt like stepping into a room filled with invisible eyes. Halfway across, the first German radar stations spotted them. Crews could almost feel the shift in enemy attention. Somewhere below, phones rang. Commanders snapped orders. Pilots sprinted toward cockpits. Windscreens slammed shut. FW-190s and BF-109s roared to life in a deadly symphony. The trap was opening. By the time the Marauders reached the Dutch coastline, the sky ahead twisted with dark flak clusters. The Germans weren't waiting for perfect range. They fired early, building a moving wall of explosions that forced the B-26 lower than planned. The bombers dropped altitude fast, skimming above rooftops and dunes as wind whipped through their antennas. At this altitude, every decision was life or death. Turn too wide, and the plane clipped a chimney. Turn too tight, and the narrow wings stalled. But the crews held steady. They trusted the aircraft. Trusted their training. Trusted each other. Then the first fighters appeared. They came in from the sea, sleek shapes emerging from sun glare. FW-190s dove with brutal precision, their cannons spitting flames before most gunners even spotted them. A Marauder on the right flank took a burst across its tail. Metal shrapnel tore through stabilizers. The aircraft yawed violently, barely recovering before smashing into the water. The tail gunner didn't stop firing even as the plane struggled to maintain altitude. Another 190 swept low, aiming for a bomber climbing to avoid a dune. But the B-26 dorsal turret locked onto it instantly. The turret's twin .50 calibers hammered the sky. The fighter jerked upward, trailing smoke, and disappeared behind a dune in a fiery bloom. The formation tightened reflexively. Bombers flew so close their wingtips seemed to scrape the same air. Intercoms burst with frantic calls. Gunners spotted new fighters every second. Pilots fought the urge to climb, knowing altitude only made them easier targets. The Germans pressed harder. They flew with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. This was their ambush. Their home airspace. Their kill zone. They believed the Marauder couldn't possibly outrun or outfight what came next. They were right about one thing. This was an ambush. But they misjudged the aircraft at its center. Amid the chaos, something began to shift. German pilots expected the B-26 to panic, to scatter, to slow. Instead, the Marauders accelerated. Not in wild, desperate bursts, but in coordinated pulses that kept the formation tight and unpredictable. Every time a fighter lined up a perfect shot, the bombers surged forward just enough to ruin the angle. Every time a 190 tried a belly attack, the Marauders dipped lower, forcing the German to break off. Every time a 109 swept from above, the dorsal turret rattled a stream of fire so precise the fighters pulled up early. The Germans grew frustrated. Their plan relied on easy kills. Their intelligence had promised a stiff, slow-responding machine. But the B-26 fought like a cornered predator, fast, sharp, and unyielding. A German ace named Max Kroner made a final pass at the lead bomber. He had over 60 victories. He believed skill alone could end this strange American defiance. He dove hard, guns blazing, expecting the bomber to drop into his sights. But the Marauder's pilot firewalled the throttles. The engines howled like wounded giants. The bomber surged ahead with a burst of speed so sudden that Kroner's round stitched empty air. Before he could correct his dive, a tail gunner caught his engine cowling with a perfect burst. The ace spiraled downward, his last words lost to static. That was the revelation. The moment the Luftwaffe stopped laughing. The moment the B-26 shed the nickname meant to belittle it. The flying piano wasn't stiff. It wasn't clumsy. It wasn't slow. It was disciplined speed, speed paired with precision, speed that punished arrogance with fire and steel. The German attack broke minutes later. Not from lack of numbers. Not from fear of losses. But from confusion. Their tactics didn't work. Their assumptions had failed. And every second the Marauders stayed airborne, their chances of scoring kills shrank. Gunners watched German fighters peel away one by one, climbing back toward their bases with empty magazines and bruised pride. Pilots kept their nerves in check, holding formation as if the danger hadn't nearly consumed them. They reached the target shaken but alive. Bomb bay doors opened. Explosions rolled across the depot in waves, so large they reflected off the water like molten mirrors. Fuel tanks erupted in pillars of smoke. U-boat supply lines suffered a blow Germany couldn't afford. The escape run was faster than any they had flown before. Partly from adrenaline. Partly from damage. But mostly from a new awareness settling over every man aboard. They had just survived the worst ambush of their careers. And the enemy who once mocked them now learned fear. When the Marauders returned to England, ground crews counted bullet holes. Hundreds. Thousands. But the planes had returned. The crews had returned. The ambush had failed. This was the moment the war changed for the B-26. It wasn't a troubled aircraft anymore. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a piano. It was a weapon the Germans had underestimated. And would pay for again. Because the next missions would not be escapes. They would be battles the Marauder sought willingly. Battles where German confidence finally cracked. Battles where the B-26 earned a reputation no enemy dared challenge AGA. The story of the B-26 begins long before German pilots mocked it. Long before its engines rattled the ground. Long before young crews whispered about its temper. It starts in 1939, when war clouds drifted toward every horizon and the United States realized its bomber force was hopelessly outdated. America needed something faster. Something tougher. Something that could outrun danger rather than soak it in. The Glenn L. Martin Company proposed a radical idea. A bomber that didn't glide politely through the sky but cut through it like a blade. Short wings for speed. Twin engines that delivered more power than any medium bomber before it. A frame built not for comfort, but for survival. It looked nothing like the gentle silhouettes pilots were used to. It resembled a compact predator, impatient to leap forward. And because time was running out, the U.S. Army Air Corps ordered it straight into production. No slow testing cycle. No gentle introduction. Just a contract and a ticking clock. When the first prototypes rolled onto the tarmac, crews stared at the wings. They were shocked at how short they were. Shorter wings meant higher takeoff speed and far less forgiveness. Pilots accustomed to docile trainers felt as if the Marauder demanded a different kind of flyer. Someone firm. Someone exact. Someone who understood that every machine speaks a language, and this one spoke in sharp commands rather than quiet suggestions. Word spread quickly through training bases. Some called it dangerous. Others called it beautiful. Everyone called it fast. But whispers traveled just as quickly across the Atlantic. Luftwaffe crews, already seasoned by years of combat, chuckled at rumors of America's newest medium bomber. They mocked its high landing speed. They ridiculed its narrow margin for error. They said flying it must feel like wrestling a piano with wings. And the nickname stuck. The flying piano. A joke in every German ready room. Yet for American instructors, the laughter overseas didn't matter. What mattered were the accidents happening at home. The B-26 early training record turned into a grim ledger. Runways became cautionary tales. Some pilots rotated too early and stalled. Others failed to manage the engine symmetrically and spiraled off course. Mistakes common in other aircraft became lethal in this one. Every crash carved another line of doubt into the program. Newspapers questioned why the government had gambled on such a machine. Politicians demanded answers. Families pleaded for change. But something else was happening too. A small cadre of pilots began to master the B-26. They learned its rhythm. They learned its bite. They treated it with respect instead of fear. And slowly, the aircraft revealed its secret. It wasn't a widowmaker. It wasn't cursed. It simply demanded precision. And for those who flew it correctly, it performed with a strength nothing else matched. Engineers watched these successes closely. They refined training manuals. They adjusted weight balances. They altered takeoff techniques. Bit by bit, the Marauder grew into itself. But across the ocean, German fighter pilots still scoffed. Their early intelligence reports painted the B-26 as unstable, unproven, a bomber designed by theorists rather than air warriors. They believed it would crumble against real opposition. And for a while, American crews feared that might be true. Then came 1942. America's entry into the war meant the B-26 would no longer be judged on training fields. Its test would now be written in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. Every sortie would be a verdict. Every loss or success would shape the Marauder's legacy. Across briefing rooms, young pilots studied maps dotted with flak batteries and enemy airfields. They listened to commanders outline missions that seemed to stretch the limits of courage. They strapped into a bomber many newspapers still claimed was too dangerous to fly. And yet, once engines roared and the B-26 hurled itself into the sky, something changed. Crews felt the speed. They felt the precision. They felt the airplane tighten beneath them like a well-trained animal that simply needed the right hands. Still, the German mockery lingered. Fighter squadrons waited eagerly for the moment they'd meet this flying piano in combat, convinced it would be slow, awkward, and clumsy under pressure. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption was. But for now, the tension remained. The Americans had a bomber the world doubted. The Germans had confidence shaped by early rumors. And the Marauder itself stood poised between ridicule and redemption. What happened next would transform the B-26's reputation. And it would turn the flying piano into something no German pilot laughed about again. And those battles were waiting in the darkening sky. The first German pilot to get a clear look at the Marauder wasn't impressed. He watched the twin-engine silhouette rise through scattered clouds and scoffed at the idea that Americans believed this bulky machine could survive a dogfight. The nickname Flying Piano became a joke whispered across Luftwaffe radio chatter. They saw a stiff-handling bomber that looked too heavy to climb fast and too rigid to maneuver under pressure. But they didn't yet understand what the crew inside that aircraft had endured to master it. They didn't know how many men had died perfecting the way it took off, banked, climbed, and returned home. And they didn't know that, by this point, every surviving B-26 pilot was no ordinary airman. He was the product of sweat, bruises, discipline, and nights filled with roaring engines that refused to forgive mistakes. The Marauder demanded precision. One sloppy input, and it punished you. One moment of panic, and it spun into the ground. Pilots learned quickly that this was not a bomber you simply flew. It was a bomber you tamed. And the men who remained in its cockpit were slowly becoming some of the most skilled medium bomber crews in the sky. Crews formed habits that bordered on ritual. Every checklist mattered. Every angle on takeoff mattered. Every throttle adjustment had a weight. They read the aircraft's vibrations the way a pianist reads sheet music. They memorized the subtle rumble that meant increase power, the tightening buzz that meant ease off, and the sudden silence that meant prepare for trouble. The German pilots mocking them had no idea that each of these American crews was building a relationship with a machine that demanded absolute respect. And that respect turned into mastery. When the Marauder finally entered combat over Europe, something unexpected happened. The Luftwaffe fighters attacked with confidence, expecting an easy kill against a heavy plane with a reputation for difficulty. But the B-26 didn't behave the way they imagined. It climbed faster than they anticipated. It held formation tighter than expected. Its pilots executed banking turns sharper than any medium bomber they had fought before. And its speed, that underrated, overlooked speed, forced German fighters to push their engines harder just to catch it. The flying piano was suddenly playing on a battlefield no one predicted. Gunners inside the Marauder watched German fighters overshoot their attack runs. The Luftwaffe wasn't used to bombers that could outrun them in level flight. Confusion spread across enemy squadrons. Reports sent back to German airfields described an aircraft that behaved nothing like the clumsy machine they had mocked. American crews sensed that shift. They felt the Marauder responding to them. They felt a bond forming between man and machine, a bond forged from those early crashes and punishing training sessions. Every second in the air felt like proof that the bomber's brutal reputation hid a deeper truth. Once you understood it. Once you respected it. Once you flew it with precision. The B-26 could become something extraordinary. Something dangerous. And slowly, quietly, across the skies of France and the Low Countries, the bomber that once terrified its own pilots began to terrify the enemy instead. The Germans still mocked it over radio chatter. But the tone was starting to change. Mocking was no longer confidence. It was denial. Because the flying piano was becoming a weapon, and they were running out of time to understand how. German intelligence officers began collecting fragments of downed Marauders. They expected to find a fragile airframe. They found reinforced spars, dense armor plating, and fuel lines routed with almost paranoid precision. Nothing about the aircraft felt careless. Nothing felt improvised. It was built to take punishment. And that discovery unsettled them. Because a bomber built for survival was a bomber built for persistence. Back in England, the men of the 322nd and 323rd Bomb Groups prepared for missions with a seriousness that didn't match the mocking calls from German radio. They knew something the enemy didn't. They knew the B-26 wasn't gentle. They knew it wasn't forgiving. But they also knew it was fast. Fast in a way bombers weren't supposed to be. Fast enough to slip through fighter screens. Fast enough to make German pilots misjudge their angles. Fast enough to change the rhythm of the war in the medium altitudes. Crews felt the difference every time they throttled forward for takeoff. The engines didn't roar. They pulled. As if the entire aircraft was trying to leap ahead of the moment. Inside the cockpit, every vibration traveled through the yoke. Every tremor spoke. Every sound communicated. Co-pilots learned to trust the feel of the airframe as much as their instruments. Engineers listened to the pitch of the propellers, the way musicians tune a string. And gunners, positioned in cramped turrets with cold metal pressing against their ribs, learned to keep their eyes moving in every direction, knowing they were flying a bomber that forced them into the thickest fights. Crew bonds tightened with every mission. They weren't just flying a machine that demanded skill. They were flying a machine that demanded unity. Mistakes weren't individual. Mistakes were collective. And survival required something stronger than training. It required instinct. That instinct sharpened with each sortie. The transition from fear to mastery happened slowly, almost invisibly. One day a pilot stopped gripping the yoke too hard. One day the bombardier stopped checking his sights twice. One day the navigator no longer felt panic when clouds swallowed the horizon. That was the shift the Germans never saw. They still joked that the Marauder flew like a piano, stiff and heavy. But the men inside had learned the music. They knew exactly when to hold back. Exactly when to push forward. Exactly when to trust the machine. And that trust prepared them for an encounter that would overturn every joke, every insult, and every underestimation the Luftwaffe had ever made. A mission that would transform the flying piano into something far more dangerous. A mission that would show the Germans what the Marauder truly was when flown by men who refused to break. And the skies over Europe were about to witness it. If you want the next continuation, just say continue or yes. You said, ICE's ChatGPT said. Here is the next continuation, moving deeper into the turning point with the same cinematic, pause-friendly narration you requested. The morning of the turning point began quietly. Too quietly for the men who had learned that stillness in war was never a gift. A damp fog hung over the English airfield, muffling sound and softening the edges of the parked Marauders. Ground crews moved through the mist like ghosts, checking fuel caps, tightening bolts, and tapping metal panels with practiced knuckles. They sensed what the pilots sensed. Today's target was different. It wasn't a rail yard. It wasn't a bridge. It was a German fighter base. A place the Luftwaffe considered untouchable. A place defended by seasoned pilots who believed the B-26 was nothing more than an American accident waiting to happen. The briefing room hummed with unease. Maps lay sprawled across wooden tables, marked with thick black lines that cut straight into enemy territory. The Marauder crews listened as their commanding officer explained the plan. Low altitude. Direct approach. Minimal deviation. Hit the Luftwaffe before their engines even warmed. The men glanced at one another. They knew what flying low meant. It meant every German rifleman on the ground would be close enough to see the whites of their eyes. It meant flak batteries could track them without guesswork. It meant they were entering a world where luck mattered only after skill was exhausted. But no one protested. No one argued. The bomber they once feared had hardened them. It had trained them. It had reshaped them into airmen capable of doing the impossible. Engines thundered to life. Propellers cut through the fog in spinning halos. The roar rolled across the airfield like a rising storm. One by one, Marauders clawed into the sky, heavy with bombs and heavier with tension. The fog thinned as they climbed above the coastline. And across the channel, German radar stations picked up their signatures. Luftwaffe commanders stared at the screens in disbelief. American medium bombers flying directly at a fighter base? It didn't make sense. It had to be a mistake. But the B-26 kept coming. Inside one cockpit, a pilot tightened his grip on the yoke. He could already see the outline of the enemy airfield emerging through distant haze. Hangars. Fuel depots. Rows of parked 109s and 190s lined like teeth. And then, the first alert sirens in the German base began to wail. Mechanics sprinted. Pilots slid across concrete in half-tied boots. Engines of fighter planes coughed to life in a frenzy. But the Marauders were too close. The lead bombardier steadied his breathing. The target filled his sight. Not later. Not higher. Not safer. Now. Bomb bay doors opened in perfect unison. A metallic groan echoed across the formation. The Marauders crossed the airfield at a height that felt reckless to anyone watching from below. A rain of bombs fell toward the German fighters. Fuel tanks erupted. Hangars collapsed. Waves of fire surged across the base. And before the Luftwaffe could launch a single coordinated defense, the Americans were already climbing away, engines screaming with the satisfaction of a clean strike. The German pilots who mocked the flying piano watched their aircraft burn. They watched their runways torn apart. They watched chaos ripple across the base they once believed unassailable. And for the first time, disbelief replaced mockery. Because the B-26 hadn't flown like a stiff piano at all. It had flown like a blade. Precise. Swift. Deadly. And the Luftwaffe was only now realizing that their joke had teeth. The sky above them would never feel the same again. But the Germans weren't finished. Pride buried beneath the smoke. Ego still alive under the falling embers. And within minutes of the strike, surviving fighter pilots scrambled into whatever aircraft hadn't been destroyed. Engines shrieked as the first Messerschmitts clawed off the shattered runway. They didn't rise cleanly. They rose furious. Behind the B-26 formation, black dots began climbing through the haze, growing larger with every second. The American crews saw them long before they arrived. A voice crackled through one Marauder's intercom. Bandits, multiple, closing fast. Gunners slid their weapons into place. Thumbs rested on cold triggers. The bombers held formation, steady and tight, refusing to scatter. They knew the Germans expected panic. They knew the Luftwaffe believed these bombers couldn't defend themselves while moving this fast at this altitude. But the Marauder crews had learned discipline the hard way. They would not break now. The first 109 dived in with confidence, banking hard to rake the tail of the rear ship. But the B-26 wasn't where he expected it. It moved faster, climbed sharper, and the gunner, braced in the tail turret, sent a burst of tracers that snapped across the blue. The German fighter rolled away in shock. Another 109 came in from above, diving toward the cockpit of the lead ship. He underestimated the Marauder's speed by a heartbeat. The bomber shot forward just enough to disrupt the attack line, and the top turret rippled with fire. The German peeled off trailing smoke. Voices in the Luftwaffe radios changed tone. The mocking confidence faded. Questions replaced laughter. How are they climbing so fast? Why are they staying together? This is not the bomber we were told. The B-26 pressed on. Their formation tightened with each attack run. Every gunner firing in precise arcs. Every pilot adjusting throttle with the instinctiveness of men who understood their aircraft to its bones. And the Marauder itself seemed to come alive. It surged through the sky with a momentum that defied old reputations. The Germans tried again. A swarm of fighters regrouped, curving into a coordinated assault. They chose the center ship, the heart of the formation, believing a fatal blow would collapse the rest. But the center ship didn't falter. Its gunners unleashed a crossfire that turned the air into a tunnel of flashing steel. A German fighter passed through that tunnel and never came out. Another burst from a side turret clipped the wing of a second plane, sending it spiraling into the clouds below. The Luftwaffe pilots hesitated. Their training told them bombers were prey. Their experience right now said otherwise. One German officer later admitted that the fight felt wrong. As if they had attacked not a formation of bombers, but a moving fortress. A coordinated, disciplined machine made of multiple crews working as one. A machine that outran them, outclimbed them, outfought them, and refused to die. For 8 long minutes, the sky seethed with twisting contrails, engine roars, and bursts of gunfire. 8 minutes felt like an entire war. And when the Germans finally broke away, they did so not in triumph, but in frustration. The B-26 kept flying. Not a single ship lost. Not a single crew left behind. The flying piano had played its answer to the jeers. And the Germans had heard every note. The Marauders returned to England as the sun began to drop behind the clouds. Exhausted crews taxied onto the airfield, engines still thrumming like tired beasts. Ground crews counted holes in the fuselage, in the wings, in the tail. Hundreds of small punctures, each telling a story of near misses and precision strikes. Yet every plane was intact. Every crew had made it home. For the first time, the reputation of the flying piano changed. It was no longer a joke. It was a weapon. Reports spread quickly among Allied officers. Fuel depots destroyed. Enemy airfields disrupted. German fighter losses mounting. Confidence in the B-26 soared. Across Europe, the Luftwaffe was forced to revise its assumptions. Pilots who once laughed at the short wings and high landing speeds now approached every Marauder mission with caution. They respected the speed, the precision, and the coordination of the aircraft and its crews. And the Americans? They carried a quiet pride. A knowledge born not of arrogance, but of survival. The Marauder had punished its pilots in training. It had demanded mastery. It had tested nerves and skill alike. And now it had delivered. The flying piano had proven itself in combat. Not because it was invincible. Not because it was easy to fly. But because it was controlled by men who refused to fail. Its legend spread from airfield to airfield. Stories of daring low-level strikes, impossible escapes, and precise bombing runs circulated through mess halls and briefing rooms. German pilots who once joked about a stiff, clumsy bomber now spoke its name with a mixture of respect and caution. The B-26 Marauder had earned a place among the most feared medium bombers of the war. Its legacy would inspire new crews, embolden commanders, and change the course of countless missions. The aircraft that once inspired fear at home had inspired fear abroad instead. And in the quiet evenings after a sortie, when the engines were finally silent, crews would sometimes look at their battered machines and smile. Not because they had survived. Not just because the enemy had been bested, but because they had learned something more important. The difference between mockery and mastery is often measured in courage, and the Marauder had demanded courage, and received it in full. The flying piano had played its final note, and the world had listened. Years later, the B-26 Marauder's reputation still resonates. Not for its wingspan, not for its engines, but for what it demanded of the men who flew it. It taught discipline. It taught courage. It taught that mastery is earned, not given. The pilots who once feared their own aircraft came to trust it with their lives. And in that trust, they found strength. The Germans who once mocked them learned a harsh lesson. That ridicule can blind you. That assumptions can be fatal. And that underestimating a determined, skilled crew is a mistake you pay for with fire and steel. The flying piano survived. It outflew its critics. It outmaneuvered death. It carried men across skies filled with chaos and returned them home. Its legacy is not just in the missions flown, the targets destroyed, or the lives saved. It is in the courage it inspired, the trust it demanded, and the confidence it gave to those who dared to master it. History remembers the B-26 not for its early struggles, not for the nickname meant to belittle it, but for the roar of its engines, the precision of its strikes, and the pilots who refused to let fear dictate their fate. In the end, the flying piano was no longer a joke. It was a testament to innovation, a testament to skill, a testament to the courage of those who refused to be mocked. And as the sun sets over the airfields where these bombers once roared, one truth remains clear. In war, as in life, respect is earned in the skies where fear once ruled, and mastery turns even a piano into a weapon of legend.